Good evening and thank you for tuning into this video. So in this video we're just going to reinforce what we learned on Thursday. I'm just going to work a couple of inequality questions for you. So just a reminder from what we learned yesterday on Thursday, when you're solving an inequality, you solve it like you would solve an equation except for one special rule. And like the rule is just on top of this page. So the rule is when you divide or multiply by a negative number, you have to flip the sign. Oh, hang on. I just now noticed that my paper's a little off. So write this in. So when you divide or multiply by a negative number, you flip the sign. We worked a couple examples in class. I just wanted to work a couple for you on this video. Let's look at example 1. Example 1 says 3x is greater than negative 6. So I have to think, well, if this were an equation, to get the x by itself, all I would do is divide both sides by 3. Same thing here. To solve for this inequality, I just have to divide both sides by 3. When I divide both sides by 3, I get x is greater than negative 2. That's my final answer. So now I just have to graph this. Well, to graph it, I'm going to put in my number line. Put your 0 in. Negative 2 is going to be to the left of my number line, so I'm going to put negative 2 right here. Now, because this is a greater than sign, and there's no line underneath it, it's going to be an open circle. And then it's greater than negative 2, so I'm going to be shading to the right, because everything to the right is bigger than negative 2. So I make my shading and my arrow go to the right. And that is my final answer for example 1. Just because I'm running out of room, I'm not going to box in my graph. Okay, now let's look at example 2. Example 2 says negative 1.5x is less than negative 4. Okay. So this is where you have to remember your rules about fractions. So negative 1/2 x is less than negative 4. You might think, well, my negative 1/2 and my x, they're held together by multiplication. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1/2. But remember, whenever you divide by a fraction, you're actually multiplying by its reciprocal. Okay? So to get my x by itself, I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal of negative 1/2. The reciprocal of negative 1/2 is just negative 2 over 1. So what I'm going to do is, to get x by itself, I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 2 over 1. Something very important to keep in mind is that you carry your negatives. You can't just multiply by 2, you have to multiply by negative 2 over 1. If I multiply this side by negative 2 over 1, I'm also going to multiply this side by negative 2 over 1. Now remember our rule for inequalities. If I am multiplying or dividing by a negative number, which I am now, I have to flip the sign. So let's go ahead and do that right away before you forget. So the less than sign is going to now be flipped. Negative 2 over 1 times negative 1 over 2. I'm just left with x. X is greater than. And then now I have negative 4 times negative 2. A negative times a negative is a positive. So I'm left with x is greater than positive 8. Because negative 4 times negative 2 is just 8. So x is greater than 8 is my final answer. Now I just have to graph it. Well, x is larger than 8, or greater than 8. So I'm going to make my number line. My 8 goes here. So x is larger than 8. I'm going to have an open circle because it doesn't include 8. It's everything larger than 8. And then I'm going to shade to my right. So once again, I'm going to shade to my right. And that is my final answer. Look at example 3. Example 3 is negative 3x plus 5 is less than 3. So you have to think first, okay, if this were an equation, what would I do to get x by itself? To get x by itself, I would have to first undo the addition. To undo the addition, I have to subtract. So I'm going to subtract 5 on both sides. Okay? When I subtract 5 on both sides, on one side I'm left with just negative 3x. On the other side, I have 3 minus 5. 3 minus 5 is just negative 2. Now I am going to get x by itself, I have to divide both sides by negative 3. Okay? So remember, with that negative there, don't drop the negative. A common mistake is to divide both sides by 3, but not to put in the negative. So I'm dividing both sides by negative 3. And remember when I talked about in class today, whenever you're doing these inequalities, go ahead and just leave your final answer as a fraction. Don't worry about having to convert it to a decimal. So negative 3x over negative 3, you're just left with x. Now look, I am dividing by a negative number, which means I have to flip the sign. So instead of putting a less than sign, I'm going to have a greater than sign. So x is greater than negative 2 over negative 3. Now let's think about this. I have negative 2 over negative 3. A negative divided by a negative is just going to give me a positive. So instead of putting negative 2 over negative 3, because negative by a negative is a positive, I'm just going to put 2 over 3. Again, there's no need to convert that to a decimal. You could literally just leave that as 2/3. So x is greater than 2/3. Now I just have to graph it. So here I have my number line. And my number line. Here's my 0. Here is my 2 over 3. Once again, it's going to be an open circle because there's no equal sign under this symbol. So it's going to be an open circle. And I'm going to shade to my right. So that is x is greater than 2/3. Let's try one last example. My last example is negative 2x. Hang on, let me move my paper down. My last example is negative 2x is greater than 5 minus 5x. This one's a little tricky. I have x on both sides of the equations. I have x on both sides of the inequality. Now remember, when you were doing equations, to solve for it, you wanted to get all your x's to one side first. So that's what I want to do here as well. I have x's on both sides of my inequality. In order to solve for x, or to get x by itself, all my x's have to be on one side. Now, I have two options here. I can move all my x's to the left side or to the right side. If I move all my x's to the right side, I'm going to end up with nothing on my left side. So let's not do that. Since this x is already by its lonesome anyways, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add 5x to both sides. When I add 5x to both sides, I have negative 2x plus 5x, which is 3x. So 3x is greater than 5. Okay? Now I just have, to get x by itself, I just have to divide both sides by 3. So divide both sides by 3. I'm going to get x is greater than, now remember, you can just leave it as a fraction. You don't have to convert it to a decimal. So 5/3 doesn't reduce any, so I can just leave it as x is greater than 5 over 3, or 5/3. And that would be my final answer. Now I just have to graph it. So when I graph it, I have my 0 here and my 5/3 right here. because it's going to be x is greater than 5/3. I'm going to have an open circle, and I'm going to shade to my right because x is greater than 5/3. And that would be my final answer. So you have one practice problem to try on your own. It's very similar to, it's actually just like the one we just worked, only with different numbers. So go ahead and try that, and then we will discuss it on Monday. God bless you and have a good evening.